With the last video, we left off with Japan's answer to prevent Western colonization. Let's remember that Japan was seeking to escape the same possible fate that befell China at that time. And that's to say, in China's case at least, economic control. Japan's solution to prevent this was to become an imperial power itself, to pursue modernization and westernization as soon as possible. So we're talking about an intensive pursuit of modernization and ultimately to become a great empire that was in league with the other great European empires at that time. So again, this is the overarching concern. The overarching question for Japan was, what makes the West so powerful? What is it about the West they're able to come to the Pacific and begin to dominate? And of course, this is happening throughout the world, as we discussed. This is the age of European imperialism. Well, Japan's conclusion, it has to do with modernization. It has to do with Western culture and Western knowledge, Western economics, Western military, right? Technology, even culture. So they understood that they needed to pursue industrialization. They needed to modernize their military. They needed to adopt modern technology. And therefore, Japan's leaders felt that they should pursue modernization as rapidly as possible to gain power, and thus in the process to prevent Japan from Western colonization. Okay, and as I just mentioned this, it's not just economic, it's not just rapid industrialization or the adoption of political institutions from the West, but it's even cultural. For example, Western education, the more modern outlook that's informed by science rather than, say, religion or superstition, right? So the result of this effort to pursue rapid modernization is called the Meiji Restoration. And the word Meiji is actually the name of the emperor at the time. We'll get to that in a second. But this occurs, as noted here, by 1868. Okay, so this is, again, it's called a restoration, but in fact, it's actually a revolution that's happening in Japan. So how to begin? How does Japan begin to think about this? Let's remember Japan's historical context. Let's say in 1867. Japan was a feudal nation, hardly modern. A feudal nation, meaning it's extremely decentralized. It's comprised of a collection of fiefdoms, right? There's no sense of collective nation. Their economics was not certainly market-oriented, and so on and so forth. Not to mention, they still have this attachment to emperors, right? As we know, in the modern times, emperors in modern societies are, for the most part, outdated. Okay, so I just mentioned that they're decentralized, that there's just a collection of different feudal fiefdoms, right? So how do you solve the problem of this fragmentation within the country? How do you put the country together? Because that is what needs to happen. Okay, by the way, this is called nationalism, when you form a nation out of its different parts. Okay, nationalism is the ideology, actually, that you need to propagate to convince people throughout that country that they are indeed just one collectivity. Okay, and again, I'll get into that in just a second. More on nationalism in just a moment. Okay, so again, the question I was posing is how to solve the problem of this fragmentation. How do you put together this nation and call it a modern Japan? What could be the social cement to create a collective nation from its fragmented parts? Well, one answer that they came up with is to choose that symbolic figure that would symbolize everyone. And here is where Meiji comes into play. Okay, because like I said, Meiji was the emperor at that time. So the leaders who embarked upon this movement to rapidly modernize Japan felt, the emperor would be a good symbolic figure for the nation. And I know that sounds not very modern, as I mentioned, but in this case, it's Japan's version of modernization. So, in a way, they felt the use of the emperor would indeed be that social cement that could convince everyone that they are one nation. And if we jump forward to World War II, if you know anything about the fanaticism of most Japanese military, right? They were willing to die for the emperor. You probably heard of kamikazes and so forth, willing to die in the name of the emperor. So that's how powerful it became as this symbol of Japan. Okay, so there's the Emperor Meiji. And as I mentioned, the reforms undertaken to modernize Japan would be deliberately named after Emperor Meiji himself. Did the emperor actually rule? The answer is no, not during this time. However, the emperor system central to modern Japan, the emperor system would indeed be central to modern Japan. Okay, and this would happen through World War II. And even today, I should mention that there's an emperor of Japan, but he's largely symbolic, right? More of a cultural symbol. He does not involve himself in rulership or legislation or what have you. Okay, and then who's ruling? The government and military leaders. They ruled, but they ruled in the name of the emperor. Okay, so let's remember what we're talking about here is this, traditional institutions that would be preserved as, ironically, you take Japan out of its traditional society, right? You want to preserve the emperor because it's a good symbol of the Japanese people. And also they adopted a traditional religion, okay? And this is Shintoism. And as we'll see, these elements would evolve to serve as fascist ideology. We discussed fascism a few moments ago, and I did preview, or actually foreshadow, the fact that Japan would have its own version of fascism, but you won't have that, what we call the Führer principle, right? It's going to be more of the emperor that's going to be symbolic, rather than this so-called strongman like Hitler or Mussolini. So it's different from Europe. Europe, it's not religious, right? It's not based on kings and emperors, but, more dictators like Hitler, like Mussolini. Here, in the case of Japanese fascism, you'll see that religious element, or religious dimension, I should say, Shintoism, right? And put together with the symbolic importance of the Meiji, who represents all Japanese people again. So that's the social glue that solidifies the modern Japanese nation. So my whole point is that it still preserves some traditional institutions amid this modernizing effort. So, how are you to accomplish modernization as fast as possible? So that was the big question faced by Japanese leaders. The first step they took as they inaugurated this revolution towards modernization was to send government missions abroad. Okay, basically they set up government institutes, and what the purpose of these government institutes was to study the West, to send representatives, and let's even call them students, right, abroad to various powerful and modern nations and to study them. Okay, today we might call these think tanks. Okay, there's a term think tank today. Certainly they didn't use that term back then. but they were indeed government missions. All right. The most famous one, it's not on this slide, but there was a famous mission called the Iwakura mission. And that's spelled Iwakura. Iwakura mission, comprised of statesmen and students to study Western ways. And, the big question in the backdrop that all these missions have is this: what makes the West so powerful? So keep in mind, however, that Japan is pursuing Westernization, not because they love Western and modern culture, not out of any sense of cultural affinity or cultural kinship, but rather out of realism, right? It's this cold-eyed realism that's making them study the West. In other words, they know Japan could perish, well, traditional Japan, right? And, Japanese society in general was in danger of collapsing. And this was due to what seemed to be this imminent move by the West to control Japan. So what you need to do is study them and adopt their ways. So what we're going to do here is look at two angles that the Japanese leaders would pursue. And the first angle would be domestic reform, modeled upon Western institutions, and then, as noted here, B, foreign policy. So let's first look at A, the various domestic reforms that are going to take place as the leaders inaugurate this period of massive modernization. And this encompasses a lot of areas. There's, of course, military, there's economics, there's politics, there's education, even culture to an extent, which we will discuss. All right, so think about the modernization of the military, for example. And imagine this: the leaders of Japan knew that if they were to be invaded or even attempted to be colonized, right, by some Western empire, well, they knew there was no modern military in Japan. How could you prevent this from happening, right? Because the Western empires were known to be militarily powerful and indeed known to be superior. Let's think about the modern warships back then with the latest technology, military technology. What's happening in Japan militarily? A feudal army. You've heard of the samurais, right? They're still on horseback and fighting with swords. So as great as warriors as they were, they probably wouldn't be able to stave off what could be a possible invasion, right, of this modern army from some European empire or perhaps even America. So they knew they had to modernize their military. They had to eliminate the feudal samurai class, the feudal warriors, and replace it with a Western-based armed forces. Think about the West with, soldiers in uniform and, going through drills and, military strategy, military science, of course, modern weaponry. So all of this stuff is what characterized the modern military. And I just mentioned the government missions, like the Iwakura mission sent abroad. Well, they studied the best militaries around there. And one particular place that would turn out to wield influence in the army was this place called Prussia, in the newly formed German nation. And they would be heavily influenced and informed by Prussian military science. Okay. And how were they going to fill out the national army? Well, they began conscription laws in 1873. Conscription means mandatory military service, like the draft, right? So they needed to find soldiers to fill this national armies. What you do is put in a mandatory military service, or conscription again. All right, so this was instituted then.